part 2 of falling techniques, how to fall sideways without getting hurt. Now, just like in part 1, I'll show you a bunch of demonstrations on how to actually fall sideways, but I'll give you some interesting statistics first. According to a recent hip study, for men, sideways falls were associated with 15 times greater risk for hip fractures than forward falls. And according to the same study, falling sideways for women was associated with 13 times greater risk for hip fractures than falling forward. According to the CDC, 90% of all hip fractures are caused by falling on or near the hip. Now, this is a quote from another recent broken hip study, and it'll lead us directly into our falling sideways technique. Fall direction was a much stronger predictor for increased hip fracture than low bone strength. When a fall occurs, changing fall direction may be the most effective method of preventing hip fractures. So as we've already talked about, 90% of all hip fractures happen because of contact directly on or near the hip. So when we're falling sideways, the last thing we want is to have contact directly to the hip. So our falling sideways technique is completely based on changing fall direction quickly to avoid landing on the hip. Now, I'll give you a bunch of demonstrations here in just a moment, but here's a little background on falling sideways. Okay, the last thing we want is contact directly on the hip. So if we're falling sideways, let's say we're falling to the left in my case, if we're falling sideways, you can see what's going to happen. If I turn my body away from the direction that I'm falling, if I'm falling to the left and I turn my body to the right, you can see what's going to happen. I'm going to fall directly on this hip, and that's the last thing we want. So here's the big idea. As I'm falling to the left, what I actually want to do, instead of turning my body away from the fall, I want to turn in the direction of the fall. So if I'm falling to the left, what I'll do quickly is turn my body so that I can turn that sideways fall into a forward fall. Now, by turning your body in the direction of your sideways fall, what you're actually doing is greatly minimizing the chances of a broken hip. When you turn your upper body, your lower body will rotate with you. So the whole idea behind the technique is to turn the dangerous sideways fall into a much safer forward fall. Remember the statistics that I told you at the beginning of the section. For women and for men, between 13 and 15 times greater risk for hip fracture lies in falling directly on your side. So by turning in the direction of your fall and making the sideways fall into a safer forward fall, you're essentially taking down the chances of a broken hip by between 13 and 15 times. How is a hip really broken? Okay? Generally speaking, if you're falling forward, it's almost impossible to break your hip. Okay? You're not going to get a broken hip by falling on your face. Okay? What's going to happen is if you're falling sideways and you land right here, when people talk about a broken hip, we're not talking about the pelvis. Like when people put their hands on their hips up here, the hip is actually that part of your femur bone. Okay? Your femur bone is this big upper thigh bone here. Okay? As you know, it's got a ball and socket joint that goes in. When people break their hip, generally speaking, it's right in and around that ball joint, right on the side. So if you land right on your hip, that's the best way to break it. So if you're falling sideways, if I was to fall to the right and turn this way, what's going to hit the ground first?
Your hip.
My hip, right? So let's say I'm falling sideways. Oh no. Look at my feet. They're straight down. Right? Now, if you're falling sideways, you want to turn into your fall. When a fall occurs, changing fall direction may be the most effective to prevent hip fractures. How does that tie into our falling sideways technique? We're doing exactly that. We're changing direction. You want to break your hip? come right down on your side, okay? You don't want to do that. So if you feel yourself even momentarily falling to the side, the mistake would be to turn away from your fall. So just like with the falling forward, the quick tip was put your hands in front of your face. This is almost exactly the same. You fall to the side, you turn into your fall. So if you're falling to the left, you turn your body to the left. And it's exactly the same technique as the falling forward. So if you know how to fall forward, you know how to fall sideways, right? So let's fall sideways, okay? Okay? You see something in common here? Mistake would be, if I'm falling to the right, would be to turn to the left. If I'm falling to the right, turn your body to the right and land in that forward fall position. Now, I'll do it one more time. This is going to prove a point. Now, your body will turn with you, okay? So you're not going to turn your body like this and your lower body's not going to stay like this. It's going to turn with you, okay? I'll do this to prove a point. I'll tie my legs together, okay? And I'll do the same thing. I'm going to fall to the side. I'm not going to untwist my legs. I'm just going to turn and fall to the side. See my feet? They come untangled. You come forward, you don't land on the side of your hip. Okay? Big key to not breaking your hip right there. So, if you can turn into your fall, your chance of breaking your hip just went down 15 times. Okay? Now, everyone still breathing here?
Yeah. We're glad you are.